When was the last time you were at the end of your rope, or as my wife likes to put it, on your last nerve? When that happened, did you feel yourself crying out to God? What are you doing? Why aren't you acting? Or in the midst of evil, have you ever asked yourself, what is God up to? What is he doing? I wanted to talk about a parable that talks about what God does with evil. Two actions, Aphete and judgment. Aphete, that Greek word, it means to suffer, to wait, to endure, to permit, and even to forgive. And the judgment, that's what he's going to do in the future. But I wonder, in both of these actions, whether it be the waiting and suffering, or whether it be the judgment that's to come, we might cry, unfair. We might say, that's unfair. How could you not act, God? How could you just wait when all this is going on? Or we might say, that is so unfair that you could act, God. How could you judge? I didn't have a chance. To which Jesus might say, but I've given you nothing but chances. I've been waiting and knocking and longing for you to respond, and you just said, not today, no thanks, next year. I don't really need that. That's not for me. I can do it on my own. Or worse, how could I trust you, God? How could I trust you? You don't take action against any of the problems or suffering. You're just sitting there. But that's not what's happening. That's not the action. In our parable, we learn that God loves us so much that he permits us to have the freedom to love him back, or the freedom to hurt each other, which we often so take that choice. Let's look at that parable. It's one of my favorites. It comes from Matthew 13. There's a farmer. The farmer has a field and some workers in the field, and the workers discover that there is what you see here in the picture. Tares, as they're called in the Bible, or sometimes translated weeds. Theologians agree this is darnel, a kind of barley that looks so identical to wheat, it's almost impossible to tell the difference until it reaches maturity. The heads go black, and they get a kind of mold. The mold is poisonous, and modern farmers still have to find a way to deal with this weed, with this darnel, so that their cows aren't poisoned by it. Now, the farmer responds, an enemy has done this. An enemy has planted the darnel there. And the response of the workers is, okay, what should we do? Should we weed them up? And the farmer says, no, Aphete. That's where this word comes in, often translated let, which we just skip over in the English. But it means allow, forgive, permit, suffer. He says, suffer these weeds, this darnel, lest you pull up some of the good wheat in ripping it up. On harvest time, it's all going to come down anyway. It'll all be cut, so that's when we'll separate it. Now, lucky for the pastor, Jesus explains the parable. He explains that harvest time is going to be Judgment Day. And he also explains something that maybe isn't very intuitive to us independent thinkers like myself, or those who, like myself, want to deflect blame, that evil is not just an external problem. Skye Jitani, an author of a book With, explained in a devotion that this isn't just an internal problem that comes to us, evil. It's something inside of us too. And you see in the text here that it's not evil externally only, but also evil doers, those who do evil, which are the darnel. And that God is going to permit, allow them until Judgment Day. I think this educates us towards a better question than what is God doing about evil. The better question we get then is not how can God let evil go on, or how can God look on when we suffer, but how can God love so much that he can even love our enemies? How can he love so much that he can give us freedom where we can choose to hurt each other? How can he love so much that instead of controlling us, he allows us the freedom where we actually can do great harm to each other and cause great evil? That's a better question than how can God just look on in my suffering, because we learn from the Bible that God does not look on with suffering, that he joins us in suffering on the cross, and that he's with us in our suffering. Now the cross is interesting because I have had arguments that God isn't loving. I have said, wow, how could a loving God do this? And the cross argues that while God may do things we don't like, his way of running the world may not be our first choice, and while God may have made this thing love at the center of his universe as a priority, so much so that we don't really get our way all the time. We might even complain that we don't like God or like love because it requires too much of us. It requires suffering. It's too difficult. But what we can't claim is that God isn't loving like I did, because the cross argues that God is absolutely at his core loving, that drives what he does, enough to suffer and die for us, and to suffer with all who suffer on the earth. In that love, he has Aphete, what we see in this parable, allowance, forgiveness for evil. I don't feel that kind of a love on a day-to-day basis. In fact, I feel like I kind of run out. God, on the other hand, doesn't run out. He's the fuel pump that just delivers love all the time, always does the hardest thing. And I find myself more the one who needs to get fueled up, to pray that God would help me to have that Aphete, to have that love. Now, when he was talking to the audience that he was talking to, Jesus sharing this parable about these darnel, these weeds that were in the wheat, he would have struck those people who had probably a little bit of knowledge of gardening as just absolutely terrible gardening advice. It is not good gardening advice to leave the weeds in your garden. I was just out on my field. I have a couple acres, pulling out ragweed, which is an incredibly invasive weed. If you don't pull out ragweed and it goes to seed, your whole field gets taken over. So this was not gardening advice that he was offering. What he was offering was a different approach to how evil should be dealt with. And it would have gotten his listeners' ears that he used this terrible gardening advice to convey it. He says that he will deal with evil. He will come to judge. It says the Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out his kingdom, everything that causes sin, and all who do evil. But that it would be in his timing. It would be in a timing where he was not pulling out wheat at the same time. Or, if you want to look at these as people, like he explains that they are, this isn't some external problem of evil, but it is people who are doing the evil being something within us. But he isn't going to rip us out prematurely before maybe it's decided whether we're wheat or the darnel that can poison. We all get a chance. Now, like the workers author, I've been reading about this parable, Capon, I think that's how you say his last name, an Anglican priest who's written some very helpful books on the subject. A compilation of them can be called Kingdom, Grace, and Judgment. What's the subtitle of that? It is by Robert Farrar, Capon. Vindication and Outrage in the Parables is, I believe, the subheading to that book. And it's a very helpful look at the parables of Jesus. He's funny, this Anglican priest, and he helps you to see a little bit past by knowing the Greek so well. And he talks about weed pullers. I often think of myself sometimes as a weed puller. I want to eliminate the evil like the workers did in this story. I want to pull up the problems. I want God to deal now with those weeds. And instead we're called to not be weed pullers, but seed planters. In between the telling of this story and the explaining of this story by Jesus are a couple of little mini parables. One of them is planting tiny little seeds that grow into the biggest herbs in your garden. The other is about yeast. And we see that the kingdom that Jesus is planting is not a kingdom of force at this point. That'll come later with judgment, but is instead a seed planting kingdom. Seed that grows into enormous things from small things, and yeast that spreads through a whole lot of dough from a little bit. To be a seed planter rather than a weed puller, I need to connect to God as a source of power. If I try to do that on my own fuel, as you put it, or as I was putting it before, I'll just run out. But God insists, actually, that for love, we need to be connected to him. To be fruitful, we need to be connected to him. I think sometimes, and this happened just this week, that somebody complimented me in their own mind by saying, wow, you're a better person than me. I couldn't forgive that person. When we think of Aphete, suffering and forgiveness, we often think of the heroes who are so patient. But I don't necessarily believe that it is heroism that can help us to forgive or have this patience, but instead it's being connected to a God who has an unlimited source of this love that we can tap into, and who wants that love to work through us. Let's look at that word one more time here. This is a Greek translation of the New Testament here. You see that word Aphete here, translated allow, as it often is. And the definition, if we look at the concordance for that word Aphete, has so many different things, as simple as to send forth, to let go, and to leave. But as you look at the other meanings that you can see, omit, neglect, give up a debt, forgive, remit, permit, allow, hinder, and even forgive. Those are really difficult meanings when it comes to suffering. When it comes to evil, that we would forgive it is kind of a challenging word for us. So maybe we prefer it to just stay as that little word let or allow, rather than forgive, which is pretty drastic. That same word we find when Jesus is describing the children that he wants to be allowed to come to him. He says, suffer. If you're reading a 16th century translation of the Bible, suffer the children come to me. That's how that same word is translated. Or when he says, suffer or allow me to be baptized by you, to John the Baptist. It's also the word that we see when he teaches us to pray and says, forgive us our sins, Aphete our sins, as we Aphete others, as we forgive those who sin against us. So I wanted to make this personal. What does Aphete look like for you and for me? For myself, I know I had a lot of trouble forgiving somebody recently. And I felt rage that even if I did forgive them, they would do it again. They didn't really understand how they were hurting me. They insisted they were right, and it was very difficult for me to forgive in that. Another place that I know this word is connected with me is a friend who isn't healed of something that I feel God could heal them from. It's something that stops them from doing something that they can do for God, and it causes them great pain. And I've begged God to heal them, wondering why he doesn't act. Why aren't you healing this person? How can I forgive, you might have asked. That person won't change. Maybe you've also had trouble forgiving somebody. And in this respect, God answers us with the Lord's Prayer. And in all these things, we get the answer of the cross as the temporary solution for evil. We might want to call out, what are you doing up there, sitting on that cross, dying and suffering for us? Just come down off the cross and do something. And God is doing something on the cross. He's doing something that couldn't be done, weed pulling, couldn't be done with a sword, with a gun, with an army. It can only be done in the cross, where he uses not evil to defeat evil, but love to defeat evil. Like Gandhi, he dies and changes evil and defeats it through his love, only to come again and resurrect himself and resurrect anyone else who will take his resurrection, defeating evil with love. Only God can do that. We can do a lot of justice in our way of calling that justice with weed pulling, but only God can work what he does on the cross. And Christians aren't just miserable people who choose to suffer now because we want to be miserable. We wait for something better that only the cross can do. We wait for his judgment, which can be true judgment. We read in Romans that I'm sure that what we are suffering now cannot compare with the glory that will be shown to us. In fact, all creation is eagerly waiting for God to show who his children are. Meanwhile, creation is confused, but not because it wants to be confused. We're not sitting here wanting to be confused or wanting to be miserable, but God made it this way in the hope that creation would be set free from decay and would share in the glorious freedom of his children. We know that all creation is still groaning and is in pain, like a woman about to give birth, not choosing birth pains for their own sake, but knowing that the birth that's about to come is worth the labor. That's what Christians are choosing. looking at that little piece about yeast that comes in between Jesus telling the story about the farmer and him explaining it, I was surprised to learn that yeast in the Bible is predominantly used as a negative thing. It represents evil spreading like a cancer, or it can represent pride, it represents all kinds of sin. Actually, only in this occurrence is it used in a positive way, to show that something small can come into something very, very big, and come into all of something big, just as Jesus' message of the kingdom has spread to the whole world. It didn't do that through force, it did it by permeating it like yeast. He represents this yeast as something very positive here, yet Jesus himself talks about another kind of yeast. He says, when his disciples ask him in Mark about something to eat, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, or as it's sometimes translated, the Pharisees and the Herodians. I was very curious, what is that teaching? What is their teaching that we're supposed to avoid this yeast of the Pharisees and Herodians? As I started reading and uncovering what that might mean, a lot of scholars suggest that by linking those two opposites, Pharisees and Sadducees, Pharisees and Herodians, people with very different beliefs, Jesus is finding a common teaching among them, which is, instead of his way with the kingdom, a more political way of dealing with problems, a more top-down, authoritative way of dealing with evil. They wanted Jesus to be a king. They wanted the Messiah to defeat Rome. They wanted him to take the throne. And he took a different kind of throne, ending up on a cross, ending up on a throne in heaven. A solution they weren't looking at, and a way to deal with evil much more effective, that didn't seem, in the meantime, to deal with evil at all. I also like the kind of direct approach to evil. I like the direct approach of the favorite movies I have, where you get Bruce Willis taking the gun, finding the bad guy. Here's the villain, I caught you red-handed, I got you at gunpoint. And sometimes he lets the guy go, gives him another chance, turns around only for that hidden weapon to come out, to stab him in the back, and then pow, shoots him dead. Self-defense. He can't go to jail for that. He was just protecting himself. He gave the guy another chance, and he still tried to kill him. But now it's over. There's no long court process. There's no juries to worry about or plea bargaining. The guy's just dead. He's done. He's finished. Justice has been done. That's quick, and that's easy. That's weed pulling, getting rid of the bad guys. But in real life, we see people are more complex than those heroes that just pull the trigger and get rid of the bad guys. Because people are more mixed than just good and bad guys. We're a mixture. This man, I read his biography many years ago, and he was a hero to many. He went down to South America to help. And he lived amongst people and learned and realized that some of the problems were happening to them externally. And maybe he could help politically. And I think he did some really good things. There's been movies about him. People have heroized him. And I think if you look at certain parts of his life, he really was a hero. But what happened to him is he started to pull weeds with a gun. He started to eliminate the opposition. And as he did that, as he started to kill, you could see the bloodlust just increased in him. It's like he went crazy with it. And he became part of the evil that he was trying to defeat. Now, while he's maybe done many good things, lots of governments that have done this have not. They've not done good things at all. Instead, they've become slaughterers in the name of a high ideal, like he had a high ideal, whether that be communism or Stalinism. People who wanted to do great things, to unite people, preaching really powerful messages, when they've come to pick weeds, have turned into Che, as he was nicknamed here, Che Guevara. They've become part of the problem. Jesus' answer is different. It isn't just to take out all the weeds now. It's to grow the seed that changes us. See, only Jesus can work resurrection and love in our hearts. Only he can change what is evil to good, through it dying and resurrecting into something better, through his love growing in us. He doesn't helicopter parent like we might, completely monitoring every action and taking away every freedom and danger around us. And he doesn't take the stage, that podium that we want to applaud him on, with that Bruce Willis kind of right-handed deal with the problem, take out the enemy, shoot him dead approach very often. More often, we applaud that action, but he's doing something small and seemingly insignificant. He's doing something with a tiny, tiny seed that can grow and cause fruit, that can grow and spread through the whole world by casting more seed. What can be done with an army is limited. Yes, you can enact justice, but usually only through one action, and that's through death, through killing, or through the fear of death. You can't change people from the inside with an army. That can only be done with his love and with his cross. So while we might cry out, God, what are you doing? Why aren't you doing anything? And how could you look on? We're supremely lucky for God's Aphete, because that means there's still time for us and for our family and friends. It's still time for us to respond to his invitation. He's given us an invitation like a wedding feast, he said in another parable. He's invited us to come and enjoy a feast, but that feast will come and time will run out, and we will no longer have that opportunity. And you might say, how could a loving God have a deadline? Because he has a feast, and the feast will come and pass. And we can miss it by saying next year, no thanks, or I'm not interested. He gives us that freedom. But he loves us so much, he wants us with open eyes to respond to his invitation, to trust him, to see that he has got this in his hands, and he's got a beautiful, beautiful plan and a beautiful feast that we're all invited to, and a resurrection to be able to attend it. So rather than making our life about weed pulling, he's called us to join in his kingdom work of seed planting. And he's asked us to let him do the weed dealing with later on Judgment Day. Instead, to connect to him. So that instead of trying to do this on our own, to run out at the end of our rope of fuel, that we connect to his love, an endless supply of love, where he'll supply what we need when we're tired, when we're at the end of our resources, to love and be his kingdom in the world in the time being. I hope that was helpful. My name is Jeremy. I'm an associate pastor at Central Evangelical Free Church